Have you ever wondered what you would do when faced with true evil? Not the kind that wears a black hat and brandishes a smoking six-gun, but the silent, creeping kind that poisons the hearts of an entire town. This is a story about a place called Redemption Gulch, a town that turned its back on a dying child. They saw a Lakota boy bleeding his life into the dirt and chose to see nothing. They had their reasons: fear, greed, prejudice. But one woman, a seamstress, with nothing but a needle and thread to her name, dared to look closer. And in the boy's last ragged breaths, she heard a secret so dark it threatened to swallow the whole town. This isn't just a tale of the Old West. It's the story of a promise made to the dead and the terrifying price of keeping it. The sun over Redemption Gulch was a merciless hammer, beating down on the cracked earth and clappered buildings until the whole town seemed to shimmer with a fever. It was a place built on desperation and the glint of gold where morality was a currency few could afford. From the window of her small dressmaking shop, Gable's fine stitching, Martha Gable watched the daily rhythm of the street. She saw dusty miners trudge from the Thorne consolidated mine, their faces caked with grime and disappointment. She saw the swagger of Bartholomew Thorne's foreman, Walter Pike, a man whose smile never reached his cold, pebble-like eyes. She saw everything and said little. Martha was a woman carved from the same hard landscape as the gulch itself. A widow for 5 years, she had come west, seeking not fortune, but anonymity. Her quiet demeanor and the steady rhythmic work of her needle were the walls she built around a past she never spoke of. Her hands, though nimble with a thimble and thread, were calloused, her gaze direct and unflinching. She was a fixture in the town, respected for her craft, but kept at a distance, just as she preferred. The day began like any other with the clang of the blacksmith's hammer and the distant rumble of ore carts. But then a different kind of silence fell. It started at the edge of town and rolled down Main Street like a foul-smelling fog. The usual cacophony of shouts, whinnying horses, and tinny piano music from the saloon bled away, replaced by a tense, watchful quiet. Martha set down the waistcoat she was mending and peered through the large glass window that fronted her shop. He couldn't have been more than 14. He stumbled from the direction of the hills, a small, wavering figure against the vast, indifferent blue of the sky. He was Lakota. That much was clear from his buckskin leggings and the single feather tied into his long black hair. But it was the way he moved that held the town captive. Each step was an agony. He clutched his side, and a dark, ugly stain was spreading across the worn leather of his tunic. He was leaving a trail in the dust, not of footprints, but of crimson drops. He made it to the edge of the boardwalk near the saloon before his legs finally gave out. He collapsed in a heap, his body curling into itself, a pained gasp escaping his lips. And Redemption Gulch watched. From the saloon, men spilled out onto the porch, wiping beer from their lips, their curiosity piqued. Mrs. Peterson, the baker's wife, pulled her 2 young children back from the street, her face a mask of pinched disapproval. Even the horses at the hitching post seemed to grow still, their ears twitching. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The boy lay in the punishing sun, his chest rising and falling in shallow, frantic jerks. Martha felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. This was more than just caution. It was a deliberate collective turning of the back. These were the same men who would cheer at a dogfight, the same women who would gossip over a fallen reputation. But a dying child, a Lakota child, was something to be ignored. He was an inconvenience, a stain on the day, a problem they all silently agreed was not theirs to solve. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The boy's moans grew weaker, fading into the oppressive heat. Martha watched as Sheriff Brody emerged from his office, a portly man whose badge seemed more an ornament than a symbol of authority. He hitched his trousers, squinted at the boy, and then turned his attention to polishing the brass handle on his office door. He hadn't taken 10 steps in the boy's direction. It was a calculated act of negligence, a clear signal to the rest of the town. Let it be. Something inside Martha snapped. It was a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years, a hot, white-crested wave of fury. She looked down at her hands at the needle still threaded with fine black silk, and saw them trembling. She had come here to be invisible, to mend tears in fabric, not in the fabric of humanity. But the sight of that child abandoned by every soul in a town that called itself Redemption was an accusation she could not ignore. She untied her apron, her movements sharp and decisive. She smoothed it out on her workbench, a force of habit before walking to the door. As her hand touched the knob, she saw her own reflection in the glass, a woman with weary eyes and hair pulled back in a severe bun. She looked like someone who knew her place. But as she opened the door, and the dry, dusty heat hit her face, she knew her place was no longer inside these 4 walls. It was out there in the street, beside a boy the world had already decided to bury. The town would stare. They would judge. And Martha Gable, for the first time in a long time, found that she didn't care. She stepped out onto the boardwalk, her worn leather boots making a solitary, defiant sound in the suffocating silence. The moment Martha stepped into the street, 100 eyes bored into her. It was as if she had broken an unspoken sacred pact. A low murmur rippled through the onlookers, a blend of surprise and scorn. She ignored them, her focus narrowed to the small, crumpled form in the dust. Kneeling beside the boy, the heat of the ground seeping through the fabric of her skirt, she got her first clear look at him. He was so young, his face still holding the softness of youth beneath the grime and pain. His skin was slick with a feverish sweat, and his lips were cracked and pale. She gently pushed aside the tattered buckskin of his tunic. The wound was a ragged, brutal hole just below his ribs, crusted with dried blood, but still oozing sluggishly. A gunshot. It wasn't a clean wound. The bullet had likely torn through him. "Water," she said, her voice raspy, directed at the silent crowd on the saloon porch. "Somebody get me water and clean cloths." The men stared back at her, their faces blank and unmoving. One of them, a lanky miner named Hank, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust just a few feet from where she knelt. The message was clear. Martha's jaw tightened. She looked up and down the street, her gaze sweeping over the faces of her neighbors, people she'd exchanged pleasantries with for years. She saw fear, yes, but underneath it was something uglier, a stubborn, hardened indifference that had been forged in this town's crucible of greed. They saw only an Indian, a trespasser, another man's trouble. Her first stop was the doctor's office. Doc Finch's shingle hung crookedly above a door that was perpetually closed. She didn't bother knocking, pushing the door open to a room that smelled of stale whiskey and antiseptic. Doc Finch sat slumped at his desk, a half-empty bottle his only companion. His eyes, webbed with red veins, struggled to focus on her. "I need your help, Doctor," Martha said, her tone clipped and urgent. "There's a boy in the street. He's been shot." Finch squinted, running a shaky hand over his unshaven jaw. "A boy." "A Lakota boy," she clarified, knowing it was the operative word. The doctor's focus sharpened, and a cunning defensive light entered his eyes. He shook his head slowly, a faint, bitter smile on his lips. "Then that's business for the agency, not for me. I'm a town doctor, Mrs. Gable. I treat town folk." "He's a child and he's dying." The words tore from her louder than she intended. "Your oath." "My oath is to not get myself killed." He slurred, gesturing vaguely towards the window. "You see who runs this town, Bartholomew Thorne. You think he'd look kindly on me, patching up every stray that wanders off the reservation? That boy is Trouble Martha. The kind of trouble that gets a man's clinic burned down or his throat slit in a dark alley. Leave it be." He turned back to his bottle, a clear dismissal. The wall had been raised. Seething Martha slammed the door behind her and marched directly to the sheriff's office. Brodie was now inside, visible through his own window, pretending to be absorbed in paperwork. He looked up, startled, as she burst in. "Sheriff," she began, dispensing with any preamble. "Are you going to do your job? There is a wounded child bleeding to death less than 50 feet from your door." Brodie sighed, a deep, weary sound. He took off his hat and ran a hand through his thinning, sweat-dampened hair. He wouldn't meet her eyes. "Now, Martha, you know it ain't that simple. We don't know where he came from, who he is. Bringing him in could cause a fuss with the Lakota. Or worse. Worse than letting a boy die," she shot back. "Worse for the town," he said, finally looking at her. His eyes were those of a man trapped, pleading for her to understand the bars of his cage. "Mr. Thorne has made it very clear. No trouble. He's invested a lot of money into keeping this territory peaceful, which means keeping things separate. His mine, his town. Their territory. We don't cross the lines. It's for the best." "Who's best, Sheriff?" His. Martha's voice dripped with contempt. "So you'll stand by while a child dies to keep your benefactor happy. I'm keeping the peace," he insisted, his voice rising. "That's my job. You go stirring this up, you'll be the one bringing violence down on us all. Go back to your shop. Forget you saw anything." Desperate, she made one last appeal. The church bell was tolling noon, and she found Reverend Michael just locking the doors after his meager midday service. He was a young man with a sincere face and a voice that could boom with righteousness from the pulpit. "Reverend," she said, catching his arm, "please, you preach charity, compassion, the parable of the Good Samaritan." The Reverend's face clouded over. He wrung his hands, his knuckles white. "Mrs. Gable, of course, my heart grieves for the child. It truly does. I will pray for his soul." "Pray for his soul?" Martha was incredulous. "He needs a doctor, not a eulogy. He's alive, for God's sake." "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he intoned, falling back on the hollow platitudes of his profession. "It is not our place to interfere with his divine plan. Furthermore, bringing one of them into the church, it would make the congregation uneasy. We must consider the flock. The town. Thorne. Everyone had a reason. Everyone had an excuse. And every excuse was another shovelful of dirt on the boy's premature grave. She stood before the man of God and saw only a coward hiding his fear behind a shield of scripture. Defeated and shaking with a rage so profound it left her feeling hollow, Martha walked back to the center of the street. The crowd was beginning to disperse, their morbid curiosity satisfied. The boy was still there, a discarded piece of refuse. His breathing was even more shallow now, a faint rattling sound. She looked from the boy's dying form to the faces of the men who called themselves civilized. She saw Doc Finch peeking through his grimy window. She saw Sheriff Brodie retreat into the shadows of his office. She saw the Reverend scurry away, his Bible clutched to his chest like a shield. They had all built a wall of indifference around that boy. Fine, she thought, her resolve hardening into something sharp and dangerous. Then she would be the one to tear it down. Alone. She bent down her movements, surprisingly deft. Ignoring the searing pain in her own back, she managed to slide her arms under the boy's shoulders and knees. He was lighter than she expected, a fragile bundle of bones and fever. With a grunt of effort that surprised even herself, she lifted him from the dirt. A collective gasp went through the few remaining onlookers. Hank the miner took a step forward. "You're crazy, woman. Put that down." Martha glared at him over the boy's limp body, her eyes blazing. "Get out of my way," she said, her voice low and trembling with controlled fury. "Get out of my way, or so help me God, you'll answer for it." For a moment he hesitated, taken aback by her ferocity. Then he backed away, shaking his head in disbelief. Cradling the dying child in her arms, Martha Gable walked the longest 20 yards of her life across the dusty street and back into the sanctuary of her shop, the bell above the door chiming softly as she kicked it shut behind her, sealing herself inside with the town's unwanted secret. Inside the shop, the familiar scent of cotton wool and machine oil was a comfort against the encroaching smell of sickness and blood. Martha carried the boy through the main room, past the dress forms draped in calico, and the tables stacked with bolts of fabric to her small living quarters in the back. It was a simple room containing little more than a bed, a small stove, and a washstand. She laid him gently on her own cot, his slight frame barely making an impression on the patched quilt. His eyes were closed, his face unnaturally still. For a terrifying moment, she thought she was too late. But then she saw the faint flutter of his pulse in the hollow of his throat. He was still fighting. Working with a frantic, focused energy, she threw a log into the stove and set a pot of water to boil. She tore strips from a clean linen sheet, her movements economical and precise. She was no doctor, but her mother had been a midwife, and Martha had learned more about tending to the human body than she ever let on. She gently cut away the boy's tunic, her stomach churning at the sight of the wound. It was worse than she'd thought. The area around the entry point was inflamed and purplish. Infection was setting in. He needed the bullet out, and he needed it now. Doc Finch's refusal echoed in her mind, a bitter condemnation. She washed her hands meticulously, then sterilized the tip of her sharpest pair of sewing shears and a long, thin pair of tweezers in the boiling water. As she worked, she spoke to the boy, her voice low and steady, a soft murmur to fill the silence. "You're going to be all right," she whispered, as much to convince herself as him. "You just hold on. You're a fighter. I can see that. You just keep fighting." The boy didn't stir. His breathing was a shallow rasp. She knew probing for the bullet was a terrible risk. Without proper tools or knowledge, she could cause more damage, sever an artery. But leaving it in was a death sentence. Taking a deep breath, she cleansed the wound as best she could with hot water and the small bar of lye soap she owned. The boy flinched, a low groan escaping his lips, but he remained unconscious. Thank God for small mercies. With trembling hands, she took the sterilized tweezers and began to probe the angry flesh. The next hour was a blur of concentration and grim determination. Sweat beaded on her forehead and dripped down her temples. Outside, the sounds of Redemption Gulch seemed muted and distant, as if her small room was a world apart. Here there was only the struggle for one small life. Twice she thought she'd lost him, his breathing stopping altogether, only to restart with a shuddering gasp. Finally she felt it, the scrape of metal against metal. The bullet. It was lodged deep against a rib. Carefully, painstakingly, she worked the tweezers around it, trying to get a grip. Her own breath hitched in her throat. With a final delicate maneuver, she clamped onto the lead slug and pulled. It came free, with a sickening squelch of tissue and blood. She dropped the misshapen piece of metal into a tin bowl with a clatter. It was flattened on one side, a testament to the brutal impact. She quickly packed the wound with clean linen, bandaging his torso tightly to stem the bleeding. She bathed his face, cleaning away the dust and grime, and forced a few spoonfuls of lukewarm water between his cracked lips. He coughed, swallowing weakly. Exhausted, Martha sank into the single wooden chair beside the cot. The adrenaline faded, leaving a bone-deep weariness in its place. The room was growing dim as the afternoon sun slanted westward. The boy's fever was still raging his skin, hot to the touch, but his breathing seemed a little easier. The rattling sound diminished. She had done all she could. The rest was up to him, and whatever strength he had left. She must have dozed off, her head slumped against the wall. She was woken by a sound, a dry, rustling whisper. Her head snapped up. The boy's eyes were open. They weren't focused, clouded with fever and pain, but they were open. He was looking at her, or at least in her direction. His lips moved, but no sound came out. He tried again. "Shh," Martha soothed, leaning closer and placing a damp cloth on his forehead. "Don't try to talk. Just rest." But his eyes held a desperate urgency. He seemed to be clawing his way back from the edge of oblivion for one specific purpose. He licked his dry lips, his brow furrowed with the immense effort. "Thorne," he rasped. The name was a ghost of a sound barely audible. Martha froze. Bartholomew Thorne, the owner of the mine, the undisputed king of Redemption Gulch. What could this boy possibly have to do with him? Bartholomew Thorne, she repeated gently, making sure she had heard correctly. The boy gave a slow, pained nod. His gaze drifted towards the window, as if seeing something far beyond the walls of her small room. He took another ragged breath, and this time the words came out with a chilling clarity that cut through the feverish haze. "Saw him. In the canyon." He whispered each word a struggle. Murder." The single word hung in the still air of the room, heavy and lethal. Murder. It settled in Martha's gut like a block of ice. It explained everything. The town's fear, the sheriff's deliberate inaction, Doc Finch's cowardice. It wasn't just about prejudice. It wasn't just about a stray Lakota boy. This boy was a witness to a crime committed by the most powerful man in the territory. Suddenly, the weight of her decision to bring him in crashed down on her. She hadn't just offered shelter to a wounded child. She had invited a killer's wrath to her doorstep. The bell above her shop door, which had once sounded so cheerful and welcoming, now seemed like a warning, a harbinger of the danger she had just embraced. The town hadn't turned its back on the boy out of simple cruelty. They had done it out of sheer mortal terror. And now that terror was hers. The boy's eyes slid shut again, his brief moment of lucidity gone, leaving him once more at the mercy of the fever. But his whispered words remained branded into Martha's mind. Thorne. Murder. The secret was out, and it was lying on her cot wrapped in blood-soaked linen, breathing its last. The secret changed the very air in Martha's shop. What was once her sanctuary now felt like a cage. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow that danced across the wall as the sun set, seemed to hold a threat. The boy Wapka, as she had decided to call him, after a gentle stream she remembered from her childhood, drifted in and out of consciousness, his fevered mutterings, a constant grim reminder of the danger she now harbored. The next morning, Martha knew she couldn't stay hidden forever. She needed supplies, more bandages, perhaps some broth, if the boy could keep it down. Stepping out onto the boardwalk was like stepping onto a stage. The usual morning bustle was there, but it felt different. The conversations that stopped as she approached, the heads that turned to follow her progress down the street, the eyes that slid away when she met their gaze. It was all a silent testament to the town's verdict. She was an outcast. Her first stop, the general store, was a chilling confirmation. Mr. Henderson, A man from whom she'd bought thread and flour for years suddenly found himself intensely interested in counting the tins of beans on his shelf. "A pound of flour and some bandages, please, Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice steady. He didn't turn around. "Can't help you, Mrs. Gable. I'm short on stock." Martha looked at the shelf in front of her. It was laden with bandages. "You seem to have plenty right here." Henderson finally turned his face pale and sweating, though the morning was cool. "I can't sell to you. Please just go. Don't bring your trouble in here." It was the same at the butcher's and the baker's. Doors were closed to her. The community, bound by its fear of Bartholomew Thorne, had drawn a cordon around her. She was as untouchable as the boy she was protecting. She saw him then, holding court on the porch of the land office. Bartholomew Thorne. He was not a large man, but he radiated an aura of immense power. Dressed in a fine Eastern suit that seemed out of place against the town's rough-hewn backdrop, he exuded a slick, predatory grace. He was laughing with a few of his associates, a deep, confident sound that carried down the street, and standing beside him, ever watchful, was Walter Pike, his foreman. Pike's eyes, cold and reptilian, scanned the street and locked onto hers. He didn't smile. He didn't scowl. He simply watched her, his expressionless gaze a far more potent threat than any open hostility. It was a look that said, "I see you. We know." Thorne himself never glanced her way, an act of dismissal that was somehow even more unnerving. He was a king and she was a gnat not yet worthy of his personal attention. That task was left to his jackals. As Martha retreated to her shop, empty-handed, she knew she was being watched. Pike detached himself from Thorne's group and casually leaned against a post across the street, whittling a piece of wood with a long, sharp knife. He made no move to conceal his surveillance. It was a message, a form of psychological warfare. He was the wolf outside the door, letting the lamb know it was only a matter of time. That afternoon, Sheriff Brody paid her a visit. He didn't knock, just let himself in, the bell jangling nervously. He looked haggard, his eyes baggy from lack of sleep. "Martha, you have to listen to me," he said, his voice a low, pleading whisper. "You have no idea what you're messing with. Thorne owns this town. He owns the assay office. He owns the bank. He owns me. You can't win this. So I should have left that boy to die in the street. Is that the law in Redemption Gulch now, Sheriff?" she asked, her voice dripping with ice. "It ain't about the law. It's about survival," he hissed, gesturing frantically towards the back room. "That boy in there, he's a ghost. He's already dead. But you're not. You have a life here. Don't throw it away for him. Whatever you think you know, whatever he told you, you forget it. You give the boy to me. I'll take him out of town, say he died on the trail. Thorne never has to know." Martha looked at the man's desperate, terrified face. He wasn't offering a solution. He was offering to bury the evidence. He was offering to be an accomplice after the fact. "The boy told me Thorne is a murderer," she stated flatly, watching for his reaction. Brody flinched as if struck. All the color drained from his face. "He's delirious," he stammered, shaking his head. "Fever dreams. Lies. You can't listen to him." "Do I look like a fool to you, Brody?" she asked quietly. "I see the way you look at Thorne. I see the way this whole town scurries when his shadow falls on them. You're all terrified of him. Why would you be so afraid of an honest man?" The sheriff had no answer. He just stood there, a pathetic, broken figure of the law. "He'll kill you, Martha," he finally whispered. "And he'll make it look like an accident. A fire, a stray horse. He's done it before. Please, for your own sake, let this go." He left, and the silence he left behind was heavier than before. The threat was no longer implied. It had been given a voice. Thorne's shadow wasn't just over the town, it was now falling squarely on her and her small shop. Walter Pike was still across the street, his knife methodically shaving slivers from the wood, each curl of pine a tick of the clock. Martha went to the back room. Wapka was stirring his moans softer now. She felt his forehead. The fever felt as if it was breaking. A small, dangerous ember of hope flickered within her. But as she looked at his vulnerable sleeping face, she knew that his survival would be Thorne's damnation and her own death warrant. For 2 days, Martha existed in a state of siege. She kept the shutters on her front window, closed the door, bolted. She survived on the last of her dried goods and rainwater from the barrel out back. Walter Pike remained a constant, menacing fixture across the street, a vulture waiting patiently for the inevitable. The town in its entirety shunned her. If a fire had started in her shop, she knew they would have let it burn. Inside, a fragile hope was growing. Wapka's fever had broken. The violent shivering subsided, replaced by a deep, healing sleep. The color was slowly returning to his face, and he was able to take sips of water and thin broth she managed to make from boiled vegetables. He was still terribly weak, but the life force within him, which had flickered so close to extinction, was now burning with a small but stubborn flame. On the evening of the 3rd day, he was fully lucid for the first time. He watched her with intelligent dark eyes as she changed the dressing on his wound. The infection had receded the flesh, less angry. "You saved me," he whispered, his voice weak but clear. Martha managed a small smile. "You saved yourself. You're a strong young man." He looked around the small room at the spools of thread and the simple furniture. "Why no one else?" "Because it was the right thing to do," she said simply. There was nothing more to say on the matter. They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the ticking of the mantel clock and the distant raucous noise from the saloon. She knew he had more to say. The secret he had given her was incomplete, a single explosive word. Now she needed the story. "Wapka," she began gently using the name she'd given him. "You said you saw Bartholomew Thorne in the canyon. You said the word murder." His eyes clouded with a fresh wave of pain, a pain that had nothing to do with his physical wound. He took a shuddering breath. "My mother. She was Lakota. She died when I was born." He paused, gathering his strength. "She worked for a white man before, at a trading post far from here. She told my grandmother, who raised me, his name." He looked directly at Martha, his gaze unwavering. "His name was Bartholomew Thorne." The blood drained from Martha's face. The secret was deeper, darker, and more twisted than she could have ever imagined. The boy wasn't just a random witness. "He is my father," Wapka said, the words falling like stones in the quiet room. He explained that his grandmother had recently passed, and he had been left with nothing but the story of the powerful, wealthy white man who was his father. Driven by a desperate, youthful hope, he had traveled for weeks to find Redemption Gulch. He didn't want money, he explained. He just wanted to see the man, to have him acknowledge his existence. I followed him from the town. Wapka continued, his voice growing stronger as the story poured out. He rode out to a canyon north of the mine. He met another man there, a white man with spectacles and a ledger book. I hid in the rocks watching. He described the argument. The other man, whom Thorne called Jacob, was angry, accusing Thorne of cheating him, of falsifying the records in the ledger. Jacob Vance. Martha knew the name. He had been Thorne's original partner, a quiet geologist, who had reportedly left town months ago after selling his share of the mine. The official story was that he'd gone back east, a rich man. Thorne said the partnership was dissolved. Wapka whispered, his eyes wide with the memory. Vance said he would take the ledger to the federal marshal, that he had proof Thorne was stealing gold before it was ever weighed and recorded. He called him a thief. Wapka's breathing hitched. Thorne. He smiled, a cold smile. He said Vance was right, the partnership was over. Then he pulled a pistol from his coat. He shot Jacob Vance in the chest. Vance fell. He didn't move again. Thorne took the ledger from his hands. Martha felt sick. The whole town had been fed a lie. Vance hadn't gone east. He was lying in an unmarked grave in some canyon, his mouth silenced by his partner. Thorne was dragging the body to a crevice when he saw me. Wapka said, his voice trembling. I was just a boy. I was scared. I made a noise. He turned, and his eyes, they were like a snake's. He didn't say a word. He just raised his pistol and fired. I felt a fire in my side, and I ran. I ran until I couldn't run anymore. The story was complete. A tale of patricide greed and cold-blooded murder. Wapka wasn't just a witness. He was the living, breathing proof of Thorne's evil, and the son Thorne had tried to erase from the world. A wave of exhaustion washed over the boy. He had used the last of his energy to give her the truth. His eyelids began to droop. Martha, he whispered, his hand weakly reaching for hers. She took it. It felt small and bird-like in her own. He cannot win. My mother, Jacob Vance, they deserve justice. Promise me. Martha looked down at the boy, at this child who had been dealt the cruelest of hands, betrayed by the man who gave him life. She saw in his eyes not hatred, but a profound and sorrowful need for the world to be made right. I promise, Wapka, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I promise. A faint smile touched his lips. He squeezed her hand, a flicker of pressure, and then his grip went slack. His eyes closed, and a long, slow sigh escaped his chest. It was not a sigh of pain, but of release. Martha watched him, her hand still holding his. She watched as the slow, shallow rise and fall of his chest ceased. She watched as the last bit of warmth faded from his skin. In the oppressive silence of the small room, with the shadow of a killer looming over her, Martha Gable sat beside the dead boy and held the terrible, crushing weight of her promise. Grief was a luxury Martha could not afford. The death of Wapka settled not as a sorrow in her heart, but as a cold, hard stone of resolve in her gut. She had made a promise, and in Redemption Gulch, a promise to the dead, was the only kind that couldn't be broken by fear or bought with gold. Thorne had taken everything from the boy, his father, his hope, and finally his life. Now she would take the only thing that mattered to a man like Thorne, his power. Direct confrontation was suicide. The word of a reclusive seamstress and a dead Lakota boy against the most powerful man in the territory was less than nothing. Sheriff Brody was a broken reed. The town was a nest of cowards. She needed proof. Irrefutable, undeniable proof. The ledger. Wapka's last words echoed in her mind. Thorne took the ledger from his hands. But Thorne wasn't a man to keep such a damning document lying around. He would have destroyed it. But what if he hadn't? What if he'd only taken the ledger book that Vance had with him? Vance was a geologist, a man of records. It was unlikely he would carry his only proof with him to a confrontation. He would have a copy, or perhaps his original records were hidden somewhere safe. Jacob Vance's office had been on the second floor of the assay building, a place Thorne himself now owned. It had been sealed up for months, collecting dust. If any proof existed, it would be in there. Waiting for the deepest point of the night when the moon was hidden by clouds and the last of the saloon's drunks had staggered home, Martha prepared herself. She dressed in dark clothing, her face grim. She left Wapka's body on the cot, respectfully covered with her finest quilt. There would be time for a proper burial, later on a hill overlooking the gulch, a place where he could be free. Slipping out her back door, she moved through the alleyways like a ghost. The town was eerily quiet. The ever-present Walter Pike was not at his post. He was likely in the saloon, confident his prey was trapped. It was the opening she needed. The assay office was dark and silent. The back door was thick oak, but the lock was old and rudimentary. Using a thin metal stay from a corset and a hairpin tools of her trade, Martha worked at the lock. Her hands, usually so steady with a needle, trembled slightly. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, with a soft click, the lock gave way. She slipped inside, closing the door behind her, and was enveloped in darkness and the musty smell of old paper and stale air. She didn't dare light a lamp. She navigated by touch, her hands trailing along the wall until she found the staircase. Vance's office was at the end of the upstairs hall. The door was locked, but the wood around the knob was splintered, as if it had been forced before and hastily repaired. Thorne's work, no doubt. This lock was simpler, and she opened it in seconds. The room was a mess. Drawers were pulled out, their contents dumped on the floor. Papers were strewn everywhere. A bookshelf had been overturned, its books scattered like fallen soldiers. Thorne had been here. He had searched for the ledger, and finding nothing, had assumed Vance had it on his person. He had been so sure of his own victory, he hadn't considered a second copy. Martha knew she had little time. She began her own search, not with chaotic force, but with methodical precision. She ran her hands along the spines of the discarded books, checked beneath the floorboards that seemed loose, tapped the walls for hollow spaces. Nothing. Desperation began to creep in. Had she been wrong? Was this a fool's errand? She sank down behind Vance's heavy oak desk, her heart pounding. Her hand rested on the floor and brushed against something hard and uneven. She looked down. In the faint moonlight filtering through the grimy window, she saw it. A single floorboard, shorter than the others, almost perfectly hidden by the desk's deep shadow. It didn't look loose. It looked cut. Using the tip of her shears, she pried at the edge. It lifted, and there, in a small, hollowed-out compartment, lay a slim, leather-bound book. The ledger. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Even in the dim light, she could see it was filled with Jacob Vance's neat, precise script. Columns of figures, dates, and weights of ore shipments, and beside them, in a separate column marked BT Private, were another set of figures. Skimmed profits, falsified assays, a meticulous, damning record of years of theft. The final entry was dated the day before Vance disappeared. It read, "Confronting BT tomorrow. He will make this right or I go to the marshal. God help me." Clutching the ledger to her chest, she felt a surge of triumph. This was the weapon. This was the truth. A floorboard creaked in the hall. Martha froze, her blood turning to ice. She hadn't heard anyone enter the building. She held her breath, straining to listen. Another creak, closer this time. A large shadow fell across the sliver of light under the door. He had been waiting. Pike wasn't in the saloon. He had been watching and had followed her. Panic seized her for a second. Then her hardened resolve took over. There was no way out through the door. Her eyes darted around the room and fixed on the window. It was a 12-foot drop to the muddy alley below. A sprained ankle, a broken leg, or freedom. There was no choice. As the doorknob began to turn, Martha moved. She shoved the heavy desk with all her might. It scraped across the floor, wedging itself against the door, just as Pike threw his shoulder against it from the other side. The wood groaned, but held. She didn't wait for a second attempt. She scrambled to the window, fumbled with the latch and threw it open. Below the alley was dark and empty. With the ledger tucked securely inside her blouse, she swung her legs over the sill. For a heart-stopping moment, she clung to the edge, the splintered wood digging into her fingers. Behind her, a deafening crack signaled that the office door was giving way. Without a second thought, she let go. She hit the ground hard, the impact jarring her teeth and sending a bolt of pain up her leg, but nothing broke. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring the agony, and ran. She could hear a furious shout from the window above as she disappeared into the labyrinthine darkness of the alleys, the price of justice clutched tightly against her heart. Martha didn't run back to her shop. She knew it would be the first place Pike would look. Instead, she limped her way to the one place in town she hoped a sliver of conscience might still reside, the sheriff's office. She found Brody asleep at his desk, his face illuminated by the dying embers in the pot-bellied stove. He woke with a start as she slammed the ledger down in front of him. "What in God's name?" he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. "This is Jacob Vance's ledger, Sheriff." Martha said, her voice ragged from running and pain. "It's proof that Thorne was stealing from the mine, and proof of his motive for killing Vance." Brody stared at the book as if it were a venomous snake. He opened it, his hands, shaking his eyes, scanning the neat columns of figures. He saw the final damning entry. The color drained from his face as the full weight of the truth he had tried so hard to avoid, landed squarely in his lap. "He'll kill us both," Brody whispered, his voice cracking. "He'll burn the town to the ground before he lets this see the light of day." "You took an oath, Sheriff," Martha said, her voice low and intense. "You can stand with him and be his dog, or you can stand with the law and be a man. There's no more hiding. You have to choose. Right now." Before he could answer, a frantic shout echoed from the street. "Fire, fire at the dressmakers!" Martha's heart leaped into her throat. Pike! He hadn't found her, so he was destroying the evidence he thought was still there, her and the boy's body. Through the window they could see an angry orange glow painting the night sky. The bell on the fire wagon began to clang frantically. This was it. The moment of reckoning. As townsfolk stumbled from their homes, Brody stood frozen, the ledger in his hand. Martha grabbed his arm, her grip like iron. "He's burning a boy's body to hide his crimes. Sheriff, are you going to let him? Is this your town?" Something in Brody's eyes shifted. A spark of the lawman he might have once been long buried under years of fear and compromise finally ignited. He looked from the fire to the ledger, and then at Martha's resolute face. He straightened his shoulders, and for the first time he looked like a man wearing a badge, not just hiding behind one. "No," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "It's not." He strode to the door, buckling on his gun belt. As the town converged on the burning shop, a different kind of drama was unfolding. Bartholomew Thorne and Walter Pike were already there directing the bucket brigade with an air of civic concern. Thorne was playing the part of the distraught town patron, his face a mask of sorrow. Sheriff Brody walked straight through the crowd, Martha at his side. He stopped directly in front of Thorne. "Bartholomew Thorne!" Brody's voice boomed, silencing the chaos. "I'm arresting you for the murder of Jacob Vance." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Thorne actually laughed, a short, incredulous bark. "Have you lost your mind, Brody? On what grounds?" "On the grounds of this," Brody said, holding up the ledger. "Vance's personal log. It details years of your theft and ends with him planning to confront you the day he disappeared." Thorne's mask of civility vanished, replaced by a snarl of pure fury. That's a fabrication. You have no witness." "Oh, but he did." Martha's voice cut through the air, clear and strong. "His name was Wapka. He was your son Thorne, and you shot him in the back to silence him." The crowd murmured, the pieces clicking into place. The dying Lakota boy, Martha's strange seclusion, the fire. Thorne's eyes darted around, seeing the faces of the people he'd controlled for so long, now filled with suspicion and dawning horror. He was losing them. "This is insane," Thorne spat, turning to his foreman. "Pike, shut these fools up." Walter Pike, who had been watching with cold amusement, now drew his pistol, but he didn't point it at Martha or Brody. He pointed it at Thorne. "Sorry, Mr. Thorne," Pike said with a chillingly casual tone. "You pay me to handle your trouble, but this is too much trouble. I ain't hanging for your mess." He started backing away into the shadows. "The ledger is real. I was there when he took it off Vance's body." It was the ultimate betrayal. Thorne was alone. His empire of fear had crumbled in a matter of minutes, his face contorted with primal rage. He lunged, not at Pike, but at Brody, trying to grab the ledger. It was the last mistake he ever made. Brody, acting on pure instinct, drew his Colt Peacemaker. The shot was deafening, a single final crack that echoed through the gulch. Bartholomew Thorne stumbled backward, a look of profound surprise on his face. He clutched his chest, then fell to his knees, collapsing into the dust he had lorded over for so long. Silence. The only sound was the crackle of the flames from Martha's burning shop. The fire meant to erase one crime had instead illuminated a dozen others. The king was dead. In the aftermath, Walter Pike was gone, vanished into the night. The town, free from Thorne's shadow, slowly found its voice again. The story came out, and the people of Redemption Gulch had to look at themselves and the cowardice that had almost cost an innocent woman her life. Martha never rebuilt her shop. She buried Wapka on the hill she'd chosen for him, carving his name into a simple wooden cross. She had lost everything she owned, but she had kept her promise. Sheriff Brody, a changed man, offered her the funds to start again, but she refused. Her work in Redemption Gulch was done. The town had a chance to live up to its name, but it would have to do it without her. She walked away, leaving the past behind for a second time, a solitary figure disappearing back into the vast, unforgiving, but ultimately just American West. The story of Martha Gable and the Lakota boy isn't one you'll find in history books. It's a testament to the quiet heroes who lived between the lines of the official record. It reminds us that courage isn't about the absence of fear, but about acting in spite of it. One woman, armed with nothing more than her conscience, stood up to an entire town and brought down a tyrant. Her story begs the question, how many other injustices, big and small, have been corrected by the quiet, stubborn bravery of a single soul? These are the tales that truly built the West. One difficult righteous choice at a time. If this story of courage and the high cost of justice resonated with you, please help us keep these forgotten histories alive. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more stories of the untold legends of the Wild West.